Hello, I'm Jeremy, and welcome to another episode of RevUs Reviews. The Twilight Zone is one of the best television series ever made, maybe even the best. The atmosphere is amazing, the stories are creative most of the time, Rod Serling is a fantastic narrator, the characters are interesting, and it focuses on scaring the audience not through disturbing imagery and monsters, but through interesting ideas and compelling messages. And while other shows have done this, such as Black Mirror and Tales from the Crypt, The Twilight Zone has perfected it. It's an amazing show that's still relevant to this day and a shining example of what horror should be. So in honor of this show's amazing legacy, I'm going to count down my pick for the top 10 best episodes of The Twilight Zone. And if I've forgotten an episode you love, write it down in the comments below. Now let's get started. Number 10, Black Leather Jackets. Black Leather Jackets is one of the more hated episodes of The Twilight Zone, and I can definitely see why. The plot of this episode is that three aliens named Scott, Steve, and Fred, disguised as humans wearing black leather jackets, have come to Earth planning to poison the Earth's water supply in order to spread their race. But their plan starts to fall apart when Scott falls in love with a girl named Ellen Tillman. Yeah, on paper this premise sounds dumb, and the episode is kinda dumb. The reason people hate this episode is because it isn't on par with some of the more amazing Twilight Zone episodes. Which, yeah, that's true, but for what it is, Black Leather Jackets is pretty enjoyable. The plot is interesting, the characters are memorable, the romance between Scott and Ellen is really well done, and the episode has a very Twilight Zone-y ending. It is kind of corny for a Twilight Zone episode, but it's still an enjoyable watch. Number 9, Mr. Bevis. Mr. Bevis is a very different kind of Twilight Zone episode. It revolves around the titular Mr. Bevis, who's a very eccentric man. Unfortunately, his eccentricities irritate his boss, costing Bevis his job. Afterwards, Bevis gets a parking ticket and gets evicted from his apartment. While drunkenly mourning at the bar, Bevis meets a guardian angel by the name of J. Hardy Hempstead. Hempstead allows Bevis to live his day over again, except everything has changed. He's not only back in his apartment and with his old job, but he also has a brand new, much better car. However, in exchange for these new things, Bevis has to give up his personality. There's a lot to appreciate about this episode, most notably the character of Bevis. Mr. Bevis is a really likable character. He's incredibly nice, sweet, and charming. And his eccentricities add a lot to his personality. Also, J. Hardy Hempstead is a really cool character, and I like how he treats Bevis like a friend as opposed to most other guardian angels who are either neutral or dicks. The reason Bevis has a guardian angel is also very interesting. See, a long time ago, an ancestor of Bevis did a kind and courageous act. and in return, each future Bevis gets assigned a guardian angel. And while the episode goes how you expect it to, with Bevis hating the new him and realizing that it's better to be yourself and not let anyone tell you who to be, it's executed in a very fun, charming way. Also, in a show like The Twilight Zone, where most episodes end up with the main character getting screwed, regardless of whether he or she deserves it, a happy ending is extremely powerful. Number 8. The Obsolete Man. The Obsolete Man is one of the most chilling and interesting episodes of The Twilight Zone. The episode takes place in a future where humanity has rejected any kind of imperfection or obsolescence. The plot revolves around a man named Romney Wordsworth, played by Burgess Meredith, who is arrested on the grounds of being a librarian who believes in God, both of which are illegal. The former because books have been judged obsolete, the latter because the state supposedly disproved the existence of God. Wordsworth is sentenced to death, but the Chancellor allows Wordsworth to choose a method for his execution. Wordsworth wants his execution to be televised and to be offed by a method known only by Wordsworth and a specialized assassin. Regardless of whether this episode's predictions of the future ring true or not, The Obsolete Man is a very good episode. The story is well made and put together, the characters are interesting, and the ending is incredibly compelling and thought-provoking. This is definitely a must for any Twilight Zone fan. Number 7. The Fugitive. This is one of the sweetest episodes to ever come out of the Twilight Zone. It's about an old man named Ben, who's actually an alien from another planet. Ben loves all the children in his neighborhood, but his favorite is a little girl named Jenny. One day, some mysterious men enter Jenny's apartment and question her mean aunt, played by Nancy Culp, who played Jane Hathaway in the Beverly Hillbillies, about Ben. In response, Jenny runs to Ben's room, where he tells her that he's an alien criminal and that the men are cops looking for him. So Jenny tries to help Ben run away. Like Mr. Bevis, the premise for this episode is incredibly cliché, but it's executed with a charm only to be found in the Twilight Zone. The acting is good, the episode has a jolly tone, but by far the best part of this episode is the relationship between Jenny and Ben. It's incredibly heartwarming and sweet, and it really helps give the episode suspense as we don't want to see Ben get taken away. And the ending is incredibly sweet. The twist is clever, and if you don't gush over the ending, you have a soul of stone. Bottom line, this episode is fantastic. It's sweet, fun, and lovable. I just want to hug it. Number 6. Once Upon a Time. This is a very entertaining Twilight Zone episode. The plot centers around a man named Woodrow Mulligan, who is from the year 1890. Mulligan is a very grumpy man who complains about various things. One day, Mulligan discovers that his boss, Professor Gilbert, has invented a time helmet, a device which you put on your head and can transport you to any point in the future for exactly 30 minutes. Mulligan, desiring to go somewhere more peaceful, takes the helmet and sets it to the year 1960. Once there, he's treated to a burst of noise and loses the time helmet. Once he finds it, he meets a man named Rollo, who believes that Mulligan is from 1890 and wants to help him. What's cool about this episode is that the scenes set in 1890 are actually framed like a silent film. There's silent film music, and the dialogue, save for Rod Serling's narration, is presented in silent film format, where a character mouths dialogue and what they said appears on the screen in text form. In fact, Mulligan is actually played by famed silent film star Buster Keaton. And the episode has a very fun, silly charm to it. There's a lot of really good jokes, some fun slapstick, and the ending to this episode is really clever. If you like comedy in your Twilight Zone episodes, check this one out. Number 5. A Nice Place to Visit. A Nice Place to Visit is a really interesting dive into morality and what we perceive to be paradise. The story centers around a criminal named Rocky Valentine, who, after getting shot to death by the police, is greeted by a mysterious man named Mr. Pip, who tells Valentine that he has died and is now in the afterlife. While Rocky is initially distrusting of Pip, he soon believes him and is convinced he is in heaven. If you know anything about the Twilight Zone, you probably know the twist ending to this episode. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to talk about this episode without spoiling it, so if you don't want this episode spoiled, then just don't watch this part of the video. Anyway, there's a lot of really clever elements to this episode, like the ambiguous jokes they make regarding the twist. Like when Valentine says, "I thought heaven would be full of nuns and school teachers," and Pip says, "Well, there are some school teachers here." Speaking of Pip, he's a very interesting character. He's basically an evil version of J. Hardy Hempstead from Mr. Bevis. While Pip has the same kind demeanor as Hempstead, his goal is to torture instead of aid the protagonist. And the ending is honestly fantastic. Similar to the final 2 episodes of The Good Place, it's a clever commentary on our desire for pleasure and shows us that you can have too much of a good thing. Number 4. The Night of the Meek. One of the most common misconceptions about the Twilight Zone is that it's a horror series. Yes, most Twilight Zone episodes fall into the category of horror, but simply calling the Twilight Zone a horror series isn't entirely honest. Some episodes are scary, but others are funny, romantic, suspenseful, action-packed. It's really more of an interwoven genre stew than a straight-on horror series. And my number 4 pick for this list, the incredibly heartwarming Night of the Meek, is a perfect representation of that. The episode is about Henry Corwin, an alcoholic mall Santa, who finds a magic sack that can give people exactly what they want. Corwin then parades through the street as Santa Claus, giving people what they want. This is something most people wouldn't expect from the Twilight Zone, an incredibly heartwarming Christmas story. The plot is good, the episode has a lot of good Christmas atmosphere, the pacing is good, but by far the best part is Henry Corwin. Art Carney is fantastic in the role, and it's interesting seeing a drunkard that's for the most part of sound mind. And similar to Mr. Bevis, Corwin is an incredibly kind, likable character. It's really lovely seeing him give all these presents to those less fortunate. And the ending is really sweet. It's really nice to see a character in the Twilight Zone get what he wants in the end. I really recommend this episode, if you're a Twilight Zone fan, and especially if you're a fan of heartwarming Christmas movies. Number 3. The Self-Improvement of Salvador Ross. This is a very interesting episode. It's about a man named Salvador Ross, who's a callous, insensitive, angry jerk. After busting his hand, Ross discovers that he has the ability to switch physical characteristics and personalities with anyone simply by making a deal with them. He uses this power to get back with his girlfriend Leah Maitland, who wants someone kind and caring. The episode has a lot of really good atmosphere, which helps support the interesting premise. And while this episode doesn't fully take advantage of its gimmick, unlike the similar Twilight Zone episode The Four of Us Are Dying, it does manage to craft an interesting story out of it. And the ending is honestly fantastic. It's one of the best endings I've ever seen. It's sad, but it's a good sad. And it's also a clever way of showing how people's flaws keep them from getting what they want. Number 2. What You Need. I'm honestly surprised What You Need isn't one of the more well-known Twilight Zone episodes. It's about a man named Padot who has the ability to sell people items exactly before they need them. A man named Fred Renard notices this and takes advantage of Padot's power to suit his own end. There are many great things about this episode. In addition to the clever premise, the ways it's utilized are pretty creative. For instance, Padot gives Fred Renard a leaky pen, which he initially sees as useless. But then it leaks on a picture of a horse in a horse race, and when Fred bets on that horse, it wins. Also, Fred Renard is a very interesting character. Unlike Salvador Ross, who's an irredeemable jerk, Fred Renard isn't a fully bad person. He's kind of like Kreese from Karate Kid Part 3, in that we sympathize with him, but still want him to lose in the end. And like the previous episode, the ending to this is absolutely perfect. It's a poetic subverting of expectations that only the geniuses behind the Twilight Zone could have thought up. Number 1, will the real Martian please stand up? Out of all the Twilight Zone episodes, Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up is the one I enjoy the most, for numerous reasons. Firstly, I'm a huge fan of murder mysteries, and this episode is basically a murder mystery, except instead of trying to figure out who killed so-and-so, the objective is to find out who the Martian is, which is really creative. Also, the characters are really good. All of them are really interesting and play off of each other really well. The mystery is effectively built up, and it's interesting seeing them try to figure out who the Martian is. The episode even tries to fool us with the red herring in the form of a crazy old man. However, the best thing about this episode is the twist ending. Even if you figure out who the Martian is, there's another twist ending that there is no way you'll see coming. Bottom line, this episode is great. It's funny, it's suspenseful, it has great characters, and not one, but two great twist endings. And that's why Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up is, in my opinion, the best Twilight Zone episode. That's all for now. Join me next time when I list off my pick for the top 10 worst episodes of the Twilight Zone. See you then.